The world is divided into four spheres, each sphere divided among continents and nations. Nations are divided by borders and interests. These interests divide the news. We examine the impact of these divisions on people and power. This is Imaginary Minds. Welcome to the program. I'm your host, Chris Spanos. Coming up on the show, some analysts see the Chapel Hill murders as an example of why Muslim lives don't matter. I'll speak with Nadia El-Zain Tanova, director for the U.S. National Network for Arab American Communities, to get her take on the situation. But first, a look at media news. Newspapers and networks, including The Guardian, BBC, Le Monde, and the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, have recently published investigations based on leaked documents about how HSBC's Swiss branch helped wealthy clients avoid taxes and allowed criminals to bank with them. The scandal has wide implications beyond tax evasion and corrupt banking that touch upon media and democracy. In the UK, renowned conservative political commentator Peter Oborne announced his resignation from the Telegraph newspaper February 17th due to the paper's poor coverage of the HSBC leaks. Oborne credits the paper's poor coverage to the bank's lucrative advertising deal. Oborne explains an instance dating back several years in which investigations by Telegraph journalists into scurrilous HSBC activities were suppressed. Oborne wrote, quote, "It has long been axiomatic in quality British journalism that the advertising department and editorial should be kept rigorously apart. There is a great deal of evidence that, at the Telegraph, this distinction has collapsed." On February 10th, Craig Stephen Hicks shot and killed Deya Barakat, his wife Yusur Mohammed, and her sister Razan Mohammed Abu Salah. Hicks' execution-style killing of the three youth, known as the Chapel Hill shooting, followed in the wake of the Charlie Hebdo massacre in France and prompted the hashtag Muslim Lives Matter. But a recent Al Jazeera article argued that the Chapel Hill shooting highlighted why Muslim lives don't matter. Nadia El-Zain Tanova is co-author of that article. She is director for the U.S. National Network for Arab American Communities. She joins me to discuss the Chapel Hill shooting. Hi, Nadia. Welcome to Imaginary Lines.
Hi, Chris. Thank you so much for having me today.
How would you describe the media coverage that followed the Chapel Hill shootings, and in contrast to other recent shootings like the Charlie Hebdo massacre in France?
So unfortunately, we hardly saw any coverage of the Chapel Hill murders when it first happened. It happened approximately 5 p.m. on a Tuesday evening. And when I personally woke up Wednesday morning, I still had not heard about what had been happening. It wasn't until a colleague told me about it, and I looked on CNN online, and I was actually very confused because it was not there at all. In fact, there were 5 stories about ISIS, but nothing about the Chapel Hill murders until you scrolled down on the page. And so it was incredibly disheartening to see the lack of media attention. I mean, this was a shooting of 3 young people. It was a campus shooting. And normally these type of things are breaking news alerts. You hear so much about it. And that just wasn't the case until, I believe, until social media really forced the regular news media to begin to cover it. Unfortunately, a lot of times Muslim Americans are talked about, or Muslims are talked about in the media when they are perpetrators of crimes, but they are not often talked about when they're victims of crimes. And I think that's what happened here.
Following the Chapel Hill shooting, the hashtag Muslim Lives Matter began circulating on social media. You recently co-authored an article, Why Muslim Lives Don't Matter. Can you explain what you mean?
Well, we really feel that, unfortunately, there's a precedence here that's really being portrayed both by the media, by pop culture, even by government policies, that unfortunately Muslim lives don't matter. Again, it goes back to why wasn't this a top news story? Because these were 3 Muslim victims. Why is it constantly portrayed, Arabs and Muslims in pop culture movies like American Sniper, as being the quote unquote bad guys? We are just just consistently portrayed as not really mattering in society and really not getting the attention that is deserved when something horrible like this happens and we're the victims of it.
What makes Muslim lives newsworthy then?
Well, unfortunately, like I said, it seems like a lot of times we're being covered when, when something, unfortunately, when Muslims are perpetrators of crimes or when it's in the context of talking about global terrorism. We know that oftentimes the word terrorist is interchangeable for being Muslim. For example, the man who actually killed the 3 young people in Chapel Hill has not been called a terrorist. But whenever we see a situation where there is a Muslim perpetrator of a crime, they're not considered a lone wolf or a mentally ill person, but they're considered a terrorist. And so oftentimes that's how we're portrayed in the media and in pop culture.
How do state policies help give rise not only to Islamophobia and anti-Arab racism, but also to individuals like the shooter Craig Hicks?
Well, unfortunately, when you see government policies that are consistently telling you to be suspicious of Arabs or Muslims, things like broad surveillance of our communities, things like at the airport where you're constantly seeing Arabs and Muslims being stopped for secondary screenings or at our borders, that reinforces this false notion that Arabs and Muslims are somehow suspicious or somehow, need to be viewed in a different way than the average American, like any other American would be. And so that's why we find these policies so problematic, because they're really framing us and stripping away that humanity of an entire community.
How can this media culture and these state policies be combated then?
So I think there's a lot that we can do. I mean, the great thing is that we are starting to engage in a lot of on-the-ground organizing, and I think that's key for overturning these policies and making the changes that we really need to see happen. And so our campaign to Take on Hate is working very hard to do grassroots organizing across the country to really get people engaged in these policy debates. We do advocacy weeks where we actually go to Washington, D.C. We'll be in Washington, D.C. next month talking with the administration and with different elected officials. And the other thing that we can do is really build strategic alliances across other communities of colors who are suffering very similar things happening to them, such as the Black community or the Latino community. Asian American communities are often faced with similar challenges. And so by building those strategic alliances, we can all work together to address these issues.
Thank you, Nadia, for joining me on Imaginary Lines.
Thank you for having me.
And now, a look at media and Latin America. In late February, CNN in Spanish published an article by Patrick Gillespie entitled 5 Reasons Why Venezuela Could Have the World's Worst Economy. Gillespie's piece, parroting most of the complaints of the opposition, claims the country suffers from a number of ills and accuses President Maduro of being authoritarian. Gillespie mentions the shortages of some products experienced by Venezuelans and harps on about the nation's inflation. But what is not mentioned in the attack piece is the fact that many Venezuelan products are provided at government-subsidized rates, and that poverty, as well as child malnutrition, has dropped substantially in the country. Caloric intake has increased, and food consumption has jumped exponentially between 1999 and 2011. Most basic services in Venezuela, including education and healthcare, are also provided to citizens for free. While the Venezuelan economy may not be the best for big capital, it certainly is one of the best in Latin America for members of the working class, which is probably why the nation's Bolivarian revolution has been successful in 18 of the nation's last 19 elections over the past 16 years. That's it for today's Imaginary Lines. Thanks for watching the show. I'm your host, Chris Spanos. Please join me next week.